When Father Keane unlocked the north wing of St. Mary's in 1962, he expected to find silence, the kind of silence that comes after prayer, sacred, heavy, peaceful. But what he found instead were beds perfectly made, each one identical, the sheets smooth as glass, and 23 crucifixes lying neatly on the pillows. The sisters were gone, every single one of them, and not a door nor a window had been opened. At first, he thought it was some kind of retreat. Perhaps the nuns had gone into town or gathered for an early morning mass. But the air told another story. It was too still, too cold, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The chapel candles had burned down to nothing, wax hardened mid-drip, and in the confessional the curtains swayed ever so slightly, though no one was there to move it. He called out their names, Sister Agnes, Sister Clara, Sister Ruth, his voice echoing down the stone halls. Nothing answered. Only the faint sound of wind slipping through the rafters, like someone whispering a prayer they shouldn't. In the kitchen, the breakfast table was set for 23, bowls filled, bread cut, and water pitchers halfway poured, as though they had been called away mid-motion. Then he saw it. Near the chapel door, a single rosary lay on the floor, its beads snapped and scattered like black seeds. The crucifix at its end was missing. Father Keane knelt, trembling, unsure if he was in the presence of a miracle, or something far worse. Because when he looked up toward the balcony, he swore he saw them, white veils drifting in the dark, hovering just long enough for his faith to fracture. And then, nothing. Just the silence of God. Where are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. If you're returning, welcome back. You already know the kind of stories we tell here. St. Mary's Convent sat on the edge of a forgotten town in northern Wisconsin, a place where fog clung to the pines and the sun rarely broke through the clouds. The building itself was an old red brick structure built in 1898 by Irish settlers who wanted a sanctuary for faith and service. Its tall steeple once guided travelers through snowstorms, its bells once called people to prayer, but by the 1940s, few came near it. Locals said it wasn't the kind of place that welcomed visitors. It was the kind that watched them. From the outside, St. Mary's looked timeless. Arched windows, ivy creeping up the walls, a courtyard with a stone angel whose face had long eroded into something unreadable. The woods around it were thick, pressing close like they were trying to reclaim what man had built. At night, the convent seemed to breathe with the forest, the sound of wind in the trees blending with the creak of its old timbers. A place built for silence, but humming with something unseen. The sisters who lived there were known throughout the county for their discipline and devotion. They ran an orphanage, tended to the sick, and taught catechism to the town's children. People said they lived simple, pious lives, but those who worked the land nearby, the farmers, the hunters, spoke of lights flickering in the chapel long after midnight. They spoke of voices, soft and distant, rising from the ground itself. St. Mary's had been founded by a woman named Mother Eloise Hart, a widow who had lost her family in a fire. She believed suffering brought one closer to God, and she built the convent as a place where silence could heal the soul. Her journals, preserved in fragments, spoke of visions, of faces in the smoke, of voices that pray beneath the floorboards. The church ignored these writings, of course. To them, Mother Eloise was a saintly woman, not a mystic losing her mind to grief. By 1962, only a handful of sisters remained. They were older, weary, yet unwavering in their faith. The townspeople called them the White Shadows, because they moved through the fog like ghosts, kind, soft-spoken, and always together. No one could remember the last time one of them had left the grounds. The convent's doors stayed locked, its bells rarely rang, and the only sign of life was the candlelight seen through cracked, stained glass. When Father Keane arrived, that Winter morning, he wasn't just stepping into an empty convent. He was stepping into a story already decades old. A story the town had stopped telling. I've read the reports, seen the photographs, spoken to those who remember. They all say the same thing. St. Mary's wasn't haunted in the way people think. It didn't need ghosts. The walls were already alive with something older, something that never left. Sister Agnes arrived at St. Mary's on a grey afternoon in October, the kind of day when the sky hung low enough to touch the steeple. She came by train from Chicago, carrying nothing but a small leather suitcase and a Bible so worn the pages were the color of smoke. The other sisters met her at the gate with quiet curiosity. They'd been told she was sent by the archdiocese to assist with matters of discipline and devotion. It was a vague explanation, but in the church, vague explanations often hid unpleasant truths. Agnes was young, perhaps 30, but there was something ancient in her eyes. She smiled politely, bowed her head often, but rarely spoke more than a few words. Her presence unsettled the others, though none could explain why. At dinner, she would eat in silence while the others murmured prayers, her gaze fixed on the window as if listening to something far away. Sister Clara once whispered that Agnes had seen things in Chicago, things the church didn't like to talk about. Exorcisms gone wrong, a priest found dead in his study, whispers of a presence that followed her even after she'd been reassigned. Mother Superior Margaret was not pleased about her arrival. Margaret was a woman of strict order, sharp, disciplined, and utterly obedient to church hierarchy. She viewed Agnes as a disruption, a storm brought into her house of calm. During evening prayers, she would often glance at her with the cold watchfulness of someone expecting sin. Agnes noticed but said nothing. When she spoke, her voice was soft, melodic, yet there was a weight beneath it, the kind that comes from seeing too much of the world and still choosing faith. It didn't take long for strange things to begin. The first was the footsteps. Late at night, when the convent was dark and the sisters slept, faint footsteps echoed in the walls. Not in the hallways, in the walls themselves. At first, the women tried to ignore them. Old buildings make noises, they told themselves. But these steps were deliberate, measured, the pace of someone walking slowly from room to room. Sister Ruth claimed she heard them stop outside her door one night, then continue up toward the chapel. When she opened the door, the hallway was empty. Then the bells began. The chapel bell, heavy and rusted, had not been used in years, yet at precisely 3 o'clock each morning, the hour of mercy or the hour of death, depending on one's faith, the bell would toll once, just once. Loud enough to wake them, soft enough to leave them uncertain if they had dreamed it. Mother Margaret forbade anyone from investigating, declaring it a test of endurance. But in secret, Sister Agnes began keeping a journal. Her first entry read, "The house breathes. I hear it at night, the sigh of the old and the unseen. The others pretend not to notice, but fear has a scent, and it lingers in every hallway. Mother Margaret believes silence protects us. I think it invites something else." The nights grew colder. Candles flickered without wind. Doors creaked open, though bolted shut. And in the refectory one morning, Sister Clara found small handprints in the dust on the floor, too small to belong to any of them. Sister Agnes prayed longer after that. She would kneel alone in the chapel, whispering words no one recognized, her rosary beads trembling between her fingers. The others would pass by the doorway and see her there, her shadow stretched unnaturally long across the floor. And though no one dared say it aloud, they all began to wonder the same thing. Had she brought something with her from Chicago, or had St. Mary simply been waiting for her to arrive? It was the first week of November when Sister Agnes woke to the sound of singing. At first she thought it was part of a dream, a low rhythmic chant, rising and falling like the tide. But as her eyes adjusted to the dark, she realized it was real. The sound came from the chapel, the far end of the corridor. It was well past midnight. None of the sisters were allowed to pray alone after hours. She rose from her bed, wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders, and stepped into the hallway. The air was cold enough to sting her lungs. The candles that lined the corridor had burned out, leaving only the faint moonlight leaking through the stained glass. The sound grew louder as she approached, Latin unmistakably. She recognized the words of an old hymn used only for funerals. Disirai, disilla. When she reached the chapel, the heavy oak door stood open. That alone was wrong. It was always locked at night, and Mother Margaret kept the key on her belt. Agnes hesitated, then stepped inside. The scent of incense lingered, though no mass had been held that day. Shadows trembled along the pews. The altar candles were lit, flickering weakly, as if struggling for air. She could see no one. The chanting had stopped the moment she entered, but the air still vibrated, as though the sound hadn't quite finished leaving the room. Then her eyes lifted toward the front, toward the statue of the Virgin Mary. The stone face, serene and pale, was glistening. At first, she thought it was condensation from the cold, but when she moved closer, her stomach turned. Thin red streaks ran from the statue's eyes down to the chin, staining the hands clasped in prayer. Her breath caught. She dropped to her knees, whispering a prayer through trembling lips. But the words refused to form. The silence in the chapel thickened, and she felt something, a presence, watching from behind her. She turned sharply. The door was now closed. By morning, the sisters found her kneeling at the altar, still clutching her rosary, her face pale as wax. She refused to speak at first, only staring at the statue. When Mother Margaret arrived, she examined the Virgin's face herself. The blood was gone, only faint traces of moisture remained. She looked at Agnes, her expression unreadable. "Some things," she said coldly, "test faith, not reason. You will not speak of this to the others." But secrets in St. Mary's didn't stay hidden for long. That evening, whispers spread like wildfire. Some said Agnes had been touched by grace. Others said she had awakened something that had been sleeping. By nightfall, the sisters were too frightened to sleep. It was Sister Clara who broke first. During morning prayer, her voice began to falter. Her hands shook as she clutched her rosary, her eyes darting toward the chapel door. Then she collapsed. The sisters rushed to her, but her body convulsed violently, her lips moving in a frantic whisper. Sister Ruth leaned close, straining to hear. "The black veil is watching," Clara gasped. "It's watching from the walls." Her eyes rolled back and she went limp. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even Mother Margaret seemed shaken, her hands trembling as she made the sign of the cross. She dismissed everyone to their rooms, locking the chapel for the rest of the day. That night, as Agnes lay awake, she heard the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, pacing outside her door. And somewhere in the dark, far off in the hall, a woman's voice began to hum the same funeral hymn she'd heard in the chapel. Only this time the voice was not praying. It was calling. The official report of St. Mary's disappearance never mentioned the voices or the footsteps or the blood that ran from the Virgin's eyes. It simply stated that the Sisters of St. Mary's Convent perished under unknown circumstances, but what the Church sealed away, what they buried beneath decades of silence, was a collection of journals found years later in the archives of the diocese. One of them belonged to Father O'Connor, the parish priest assigned to hear the sisters' confessions in the months before they vanished. His entries were sparse at first, routine, mentions of faith, weather, illness, the monotony of convent life. But after October of 1961, the tone began to change. "The sisters speak of figures in the dark," he wrote. "They say the shadows move even when the candles are still." One claims she saw hands pressed against the inside of the chapel walls. Another insists she heard someone whispering her name in Latin as she slept. He tried to reassure them, of course, to remind them that fear is the devil's oldest language. But the entries grew more desperate. "I have heard it too," he confessed in one of the final pages. "Something is walking these halls that does not wear a habit." The Church confiscated his journals after his sudden resignation. He was found weeks later in his rectory, the walls covered in verses from the Book of Job, written in his own blood. Among those sealed records was another book, smaller, bound in faded blue leather. It belonged to Sister Agnes. Unlike the priest's precise handwriting, hers was uneven, erratic, like someone writing in the dark. I've read her words, though parts have faded with time. The entries are not confessions. They are warnings. We were told not to question miracles, one passage reads, even when they screamed. Another, Mother Margaret says fear is a sin. But I think faith can rot too when you keep it in the dark too long. And another, written in what appears to be candle wax and soot. There are rooms we're told not to enter, not because they are empty, but because they are not. Agnes describes nights when the air seemed to bend, when voices whispered prayers backward, when the sisters' reflections in the chapel mirror didn't move quite the same way they did. She wrote of dreams where she wandered through endless corridors, every door locked, every wall breathing. Sometimes she woke to find her hands bruised, her rosary beads twisted around her wrists like chains. One entry, dated just 3 days before the disappearance, is almost unreadable, ink smeared by what might have been tears. There is something beneath us, she wrote. It knows our names. It wants to be remembered. After that, the entries stop. The remaining pages are blank, except for a single line written at the very end, pressed deep into the paper as if carved by force. The black veil is open. No one knows what she meant by that. Some believe the black veil referred to a forbidden ritual, an old convent legend meant to test faith. Others think it was the name the sisters gave to whatever haunted St. Mary's. But when you hold those pages, when you trace the trembling ink and the faint outline of the cross pressed into the cover, you can almost feel it, the weight of something unfinished, something that refused to die when the nuns did. The night it happened, the storm rolled in without warning. By sundown, the sky above St. Mary's had turned the color of bruised iron. Lightning flashed across the pines, throwing the convent's shadow against the clouds like a black crown. The air was heavy, electric, pressing down on the old stone walls, as though the heavens themselves were preparing to split. Inside, the sisters gathered for evening prayer, their voices trembling over the sound of distant thunder. Sister Agnes wrote her final journal entry just before the lights went out. The ink is faint now, water-stained, but the words still carry their weight. The air feels wrong tonight. The walls hum when the wind stops. Sister Ruth says she saw a shape at the end of the corridor, something tall, watching. We prayed, but it did not leave. I think it waits for the bell. She underlined that last sentence twice. The bell. At 10:43 p.m., the power failed. The generator in the basement sputtered once, coughed and died. The entire convent fell into darkness. The only light came from the flashes outside, lightning illuminating the hallways in short, violent bursts. In those flickers, the sisters said later, at least the ones who lived nearby and saw through the windows, they could see movement inside the convent. Figures, small and white, gliding down the hall toward the north wing. Sister Clara, though still weak from her collapse days earlier, rose from bed when she heard it, a single, low bell tolling from beneath the floorboards. Not from the chapel, but deeper, far below. The catacombs. The sound was muffled, metallic, resonant, as though struck by a hand that no longer felt flesh. One by one, the nuns began to wake. None spoke. None lit candles. They simply rose, as if following a command only they could hear. Their bare feet whispered across the wooden floor, moving in perfect unison down the corridor. Sister Agnes followed last, clutching her journal against her chest, her eyes glassy with dread. Outside, the storm raged harder. Rain battered the stained glass so violently that the painted saints seemed to bleed. Father Keane, asleep in the rectory across the field, would later tell investigators that he awoke to the sound of chanting carried through the wind, Latin phrases that made no sense, fragmented prayers repeated in a rhythm too slow, too heavy to be human. Inside St. Mary's, the sisters gathered in the chapel. The door to the north wing stood open. None of them had ever been allowed to enter. It was sealed years ago, after the old infirmary beneath had flooded. But that night it gaped like a mouth. From within came a faint red glow, pulsing like the last heartbeat of a dying ember. Sister Agnes stepped forward first. Her hand trembled as she traced the sign of the cross on her chest. In her journal, the final entry ends mid-sentence. If faith is surrender, then tonight we are already lost. The bell! The rest trails off into nothing. What happened after that can only be pieced together from fragments, eyewitness accounts, police photographs, and the few physical traces left behind. The next morning, when Father Keane arrived for morning mass, the storm had passed. The air was unnaturally still. No birds sang. The fields shimmered with water, reflecting a dull grey sky. He noticed immediately that the chapel bell had not rung at dawn. When he entered, the front doors opened easily, though the locks had been bolted. Inside, the candles were burnt down to puddles of wax. The pews were wet, as though from heavy rain, though no windows were broken. He called out for the sisters. No one answered. He searched every room, dormitories, kitchen, laundry. Every bed was perfectly made, every personal belonging neatly arranged. It looked less like a place abandoned and more like one prepared for inspection. Then he reached the north wing. The door was ajar, just as it had been in Agnes's notes. The hinges groaned as he pushed it open. A rush of air, damp and cold, met him like breath. The hallway beyond was narrow, lined with crucifixes that had been turned upside down. At the end of the corridor stood a heavy iron door, one that led down to the catacombs. It was locked. From the inside, he pounded on it, shouting their names. When it finally gave way, the lock broken by force, he stepped into the darkness below. The stairs descended into water, black and motionless. The smell of earth and iron filled his lungs. His lantern flickered as he scanned the crypt. There were no bodies. Only footprints, bare, small, circling the chamber again and again until they vanished at the far wall. And there, carved into the stone above the old altar, were the words, "The veil is open." Father Keane stumbled backward, crossing himself over and over, whispering prayers he couldn't remember fully. When he emerged into daylight, he found the convent silent, the air heavy, with a smell like burnt incense and rain. He rang the chapel bell with all his strength, but the sound barely carried. It was as if the world refused to hear. By noon, the police had arrived. They found no signs of struggle. No blood, no evidence of escape. Only 23 beds with crucifixes laid neatly on each pillow. Every rosary accounted for except one, the one Sister Agnes had carried. The church declared it a tragedy, a mystery without malice. The official report used the word vanishing, a word that belonged to folklore, not faith. They sealed the building within the week, padlocked the gates, and sent a new priest to tend the grounds. But for months afterward, travelers passing through claimed to see candlelight flickering behind the chapel windows. Some said they heard the faint toll of a bell just before dawn, and sometimes, on the windless nights when the fog rolls low and the fields are still, locals swear they hear voices coming from beneath the earth, women's voices, chanting in Latin, always the same refrain, slow and sorrowful, Dies irae, dies illa, the day of wrath, that day, the day the Sisters of St. Mary's never came back. By the time the authorities arrived at St. Mary's, the storm had already burned itself out, leaving behind a thin fog that clung to the ground like breath from something sleeping beneath it. The road leading up to the convent was slick with mud, and the patrol car's tires sank deep into the earth as two deputies stepped out, their flashlights cutting through the pale morning mist. Inside, Father Keane waited by the chapel door, pale and shaking. He'd been pacing for hours, clutching his rosary so tightly the beads had left small red circles in his palm. When the deputies asked what had happened, he simply pointed down the hall toward the dormitories. "They're gone," he whispered. "All of them." At first, the police thought it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the sisters had been evacuated because of the storm or taken shelter somewhere else. But as they searched, the truth pressed itself against them like cold air. The place was untouched, every door locked from within, every window unbroken, the dining hall still set for breakfast. There was no chaos, no struggle, no sound, only order, too much order. One officer later said it felt like walking into a photograph. Everything was still, he told a reporter years later, like time had decided it wasn't welcome anymore. By mid-afternoon, a small crowd had gathered at the gates, farmers, parishioners, children clutching rosaries. Word had spread fast. The nuns of St. Mary's were gone. Some came to pray, others came to see. But when the wind shifted and the chapel bell groaned once, every head turned toward the building and a hush fell over the crowd. Inside, investigators worked under orders from both the diocese and the county. They catalogued everything. Crucifixes on pillows, untouched beds, footprints leading to nowhere. They drained the catacombs, only to find bare stone and stagnant water. Not a trace of human remains, not a single garment or scrap of cloth, and yet there were sounds, a low hum in the walls, like the vibration of a pipe or the faint murmur of distant voices. When one officer leaned close to the chapel altar, he swore he heard a hymn, soft, slow, echoing from beneath the marble. It was the kind of sound that makes you forget to breathe, he said later. Not singing exactly, more like remembering. Within a week, the church had taken over. The investigation was officially closed under the title Act of God, pending divine clarification. Father Keane was transferred to another parish without explanation. The convent was locked, the grounds blessed, and the remaining journals, including Sister Agnes's, were confiscated by the archdiocese. No one ever saw them again, but silence doesn't last long in small towns. Stories began to leak. The milkman claimed he saw candlelight flickering in the chapel windows long after midnight. A group of boys, daring each other to peek through the convent fence, swore they heard footsteps pacing the corridors. 23 sets. In perfect rhythm then came the hymns, on certain nights, when the fog was thick enough to blur the world to grey. The people living near St. Mary's said they could hear music, faint at first, just a hum rising from the fields. But if you stood still long enough, it became words. Latin old and mournful. Ave Maris Stella, they said. Hail, Star of the Sea. It didn't come from the bell tower or the chapel. It came from the ground. From beneath the convent, the church dismissed it as superstition. Echoes, they said. Old stone remembers sound. But those who lived nearby told a different story. They believed the sisters hadn't disappeared at all, that they'd given themselves, willingly or not, to something older than the church itself, that they hadn't died. They had merged with the house of God. One farmer swore he saw them once at dawn. He said they were walking across the field behind the convent, 23 silhouettes in white, their veils trailing like smoke. He called out to them, but they didn't turn. They just kept walking slowly toward the chapel doors. And as the sun broke over the horizon, he said, they simply faded. Weeks later, the Vatican quietly purchased the land around St. Mary's. The convent was never reopened, but no one ever dared tear it down either. The walls still stand, cracked and dark with moss. No birds nest there. No one stays past dusk. And yet sometimes, when the wind moves just right through the empty corridors, it carries a sound, soft, distant, and full of something that isn't grief, but isn't peace either. It's said if you listen closely, you can still hear them, 23 voices, whispering prayers that no longer belong to this world. I came to St. Mary's on a grey October morning, 59 years after the sisters vanished. The road that led there was little more than a scar through the forest, narrow, cracked and swallowed in places by roots and vines. My editor called it a ghost story with too many facts to ignore. I called it an obsession. The convent appeared through the mist like a memory, old, reluctant to be seen. Its brick walls were dark with age, the steeple tilting slightly toward the forest, as though in confession. Every window was boarded, every door chained, but the place still felt alive. The air carried the faintest smell of incense and burnt wax. Though no one had prayed here in decades, I wasn't alone. My producer, Callum, trailed behind me, carrying the camera and EVP recorder. He'd worked on plenty of ghost documentaries before, but something about St. Mary's made him uneasy. He said it felt like walking into a church where the sermon never ended, We climbed through a side window where the boards had rotted. Inside, the air was heavy, stale, thick with mold and dust. Light sliced through the cracks in thin golden shafts, catching motes that drifted like ash. The chapel still stood mostly intact. Pews warped and broken, altar stripped bare. But the crucifix above the altar, the one the police had described in 1962, was still there. Only now it hung upside down. I pressed record. For the first hour we walked the halls in silence, letting the EVP run. The floors creaked beneath us, the sound echoing through the vast emptiness. In one of the dormitories, the bed still stood in neat rows, rusted frames holding the shape of lives long gone. On one pillow, Callum found a rosary. Small, tarnished and broken, a single bead missing. It wasn't until we reached the north wing that the recorder picked something up. At first it was static, the usual interference. Then came a low hum, a rhythm, faint, almost too soft to notice. I leaned close to the speaker, adjusting the gain. Beneath the crackle, words began to form, Latin, slow and deliberate, Ave Maris Stella. De Mater Alma. Hail, star of the sea. Gentle mother of God, Callum froze.
That's not playback, is it?
He whispered. I shook my head. The voices, if that's what they weren't repeating in loops. They were responding. The hum rose and fell like breathing, like a congregation caught mid-prayer. We followed the sound down to the catacomb door. The same one from Father Keane's report. It was rusted now, barely hanging on its hinges. When I touched it, the metal was ice cold. On the stone above it, faint and almost gone, the carved words could still be made out. The veil is open. I don't remember deciding to go in. I just remember the air growing colder the deeper we went. The steps were slick with moss, the walls lined with strange scorch marks, circular, like halos burned into stone. At the bottom, water covered the floor, reflecting our flashlight beams in trembling patterns. That's when I saw them. Not figures, not really, but impressions, shapes in the dark water, rising for a moment and fading before my brain could make sense of them. I thought I heard the whisper of fabric, the echo of footsteps moving just beyond the beam of light. Callum grabbed my arm. Listen, he said. The EVP was screaming with sound now, not white noise, but prayers. Dozens of voices rising together, their words fractured but fervent. Among them, one stood out, a woman's voice, clearer than the rest. If faith is surrender, then tonight we are already lost. Sister Agnes. The same line from her final journal entry. We stumbled out of the catacombs minutes later, though it felt like hours. The air outside hit like surfacing from underwater. I checked the recorder. The timer read 37 minutes. We'd only been below for 5. That night, back in my motel room, I began digging deeper into the history of St. Mary's, old county records, property deeds, fire reports, anything that could explain what we'd heard. What I found changed everything. Before St. Mary's was a convent, it had been something else. An asylum. St. Dymphna's Sanitarium for Women, built in 1886. It burned to the ground in 1894 after a boiler explosion. 23 women died in the blaze. Not patients, nurses. The church purchased the land a year later, built the convent directly over the ruins, and consecrated it as a place of healing and purity. The official record listed the site of the old sanitarium's morgue beneath. What would become the chapel's foundation? Looked again at the photos from our visit. The chapel, the altar, the catacomb stairs. Everything aligned perfectly. The bell that rang from below, the weeping statue, the chanting from the earth. None of it was random. It was repetition. The Sisters of St. Mary's hadn't just vanished. They'd been drawn back into the cycle of the place. 23 souls, echoing the same fate that had already played out once before. That night, I played back the last few seconds of the recording one more time. After the hymns faded, after the static thinned, one last whisper bled through the silence. A woman's voice, faint but unmistakable. The nurses stayed to serve. The sisters stayed to pray. We are the same now. Then, just before the recorder clicked off, the sound of a single bell, deep, distant, and final. Maybe they vanished into faith itself, consumed by the very silence they worshipped. That's what I keep thinking when I play the recording back late at night, listening to those faint voices rise and fall like breath through the static. There's something heartbreaking about the way they sound, not lost, not frightened, but devoted, as if whatever called to them wasn't evil, just eternal. Standing there in the ruins of St. Mary's, I tried to imagine what that moment must have felt like. The storm outside, the bell below, the slow march into darkness. Were they terrified, or did they believe they were stepping closer to God? Faith has a way of blurring those lines. Sometimes what we mistake for salvation is only surrender in disguise. The church never reopened the convent. The walls still stand, swallowing moss and time. The official record calls it an unsolved disappearance, but that feels too simple, too human. Because when the wind moves through the empty corridors, it still carries the faintest trace of music. Not random sound, not echoes, hymns. 23 voices, soft and patient, repeating the same Latin verse over and over again. Dis irae, dis illa. The day of wrath, that day. Maybe it's just the building settling. Maybe it's water in the pipes or imagination in the dark. But sometimes I think, what if they didn't disappear from this world? What if they disappeared into something else? A silence deeper than death. A prayer that never ends. A faith that finally answered back. And maybe that's the real tragedy of St. Mary's, not that 23 sisters were lost, but that somewhere beneath all that stone and time, they might still be praying.